Hey Bullets YouTube channel.
Hurry up, now tell us why you're here.
Rowdy Revan Bush will start at pole position with Ryan inside laning, who's outside. Row 2 has Nick Shift and Kyle Carson starting in this row. I hope they do well this race. Now on to row 3 where Gogo Logano and Jackson Storm will start in the same row. Row 4 has Denny Carlin and Martin Carrix Jr. both hoping to do well this race. Now on to row 5 where both JP Drive and Tim Treadless will start, both hoping to do better this race. Now on to row 6 where the Garrison Motorsports racers of Chris Roman and James himself will start. Row 7 has JD McPillar starting alongside Aaron Clocker. Now on to row 8 where Harvey Rodcap will be starting alongside Cruz Ramirez, who was terrible in practice. Row 9 has Bubba Wheelhouse and Ryan Newcar, the Rocket, not near the front, who's outside. Now on to row 10 where Danny Swervez will be starting alongside Billy Carjoy, who performed really well in practice. Now on to row 11 where Cam Spinner and Kurt Bushtire will start. I wonder how they'll do this race. Now on to row 12 where both Bad Brad Karslowski and Flipped Over are disappointed with their qualifying results. Now on to row 13 where Sebastian Silva and Kevin Karvik will start. I wonder how they'll do this race. Same with the racers in row 14, Dan Garcia and H.J. Hollis, who's disappointed by this qualifying result. Same with Chase Racelot on the inside of row 15. Herb Kerbler starts who's outside. Row 16 has two blue cars, Ed Trunken and Spikey Phillips, both hoping to do well this race. Row 17 has Henry Dahl, who continues to qualify. Same with Paul Conrev, who's outside. Row 18 has Arthur Carstro and Jonas Carvers to his outside. Now on to row 19 where Ricky Speedster will be making his second start of the season and Chris Pusher will be making his Piston Cup debut. Row 20 has Ty Rod also making his Piston Cup debut this race and Rich Mixon who's outside. Row 21 has another debutant, Marco Ricci with Conrad Camber who's outside. And starting in 43rd is another racer making his very first start, Donald Rodriguez, who beats Richie Gunzit and these 14 other racers, among many others, to qualify for this race. Now onto the race where Rowdy Revan Bush will lead the first 23 laps of the race before losing the lead to Kyle Carson. He would lead into lap 28 before he'd lose the lead to Denny Carlin, who would lead for 2 laps before losing the lead himself to the other number 11 car, Chris Roman, who would lead until lap 36. But then he'd lose the lead to JP Drive, who would lead for 2 laps before losing the lead to Bubba Wheelhouse off of Pit Cycles. But on lap 39, he would lose the lead to Billy Carjoy, who would lead for 2 laps, but then lose the lead to his team owner, James Garrison, who would lead for 6 laps before losing the lead to Jackson Storm. He would only lead for 2 more laps before Chase Racelot would take the lead from him. But he would not lead for very long, only a handful of yards before Harvey Rodcap would take the lead. He would lead the field until lap 50, where roughly halfway through the lap, Martin Carrix Jr. would take the lead. He would lead until lap 53, where Gogo Logano would take the lead. But on lap 55, Denny Carlin would push Gogo Logano, and then Gogo Logano would push Denny Carlin back later that lap. And then Rowdy Revan Bush would take the lead as a result and lead until lap 58, where Jackson Storm would take the lead once again. He would lead for 2 more laps before Ryan inside Laney would pass him on the inside and take the lead for himself, leading until lap 64, where Jackson Storm would retake the lead. He would lead for 5 more laps before Tim Treadless would take the lead. He would lead the field until lap 70, until right before turn 1, where Rowdy Revan Bush would retake the lead. He would lead into lap 73, where James Garrison would take the lead for himself. He would lead for 3 more laps before Henry Dahl would take the lead, leading for just 1 lap before Harvey Rodcap would also lead for just 1 lap. And then Denny Carlin would retake the lead, leading the field into lap 77. But roughly halfway through the lap, Arthur Carstro would take the lead for himself. But he would only lead for about 100 yards before Flipped Over would take the lead for himself, leading all the way until lap 79, where Chase Racelot would take the lead once again, leading until lap 80, where James Garrison would retake the lead. He would lead for 8 more laps before Jackson Storm would take the lead once again. He would lead all the way until lap 94, where Bad Brad Karslowski would pass him, and he would lead until lap 96, where Rowdy Revan Bush would retake the lead once again, leading until lap 97, where Martin Carx Jr. would take the lead again. He would lead until lap 101, where Jackson Storm would take the lead again. But he wouldn't lead for very long, as James Garrison would retake the lead on lap 102. But 3 laps later, Chris Roman would be back in the lead, leading for 3 more laps before Gogo Logano, this time with a clean pass, would take the lead. He would lead for 4 laps before JP Drive would take the lead for himself. He would lead for 2 more laps before Flipped Over would take the lead for himself, leading the field into lap 115. But right before turn 4, Nick Shift would take the lead, leading for almost 4 laps. But then Rowdy Revan Bush would take the lead. He would lead for 2 more laps, but unfortunately on lap 121, Marco Ricci is now out because of a transmission issue. And Jackson Storm will take the lead after the restart and lead for 2 more laps before JD McPillar would take the lead for the first time this race. But on lap 127, his team owner James Garrison would retake the lead. He would lead for 1 more lap after that before Cruz Ramirez would lead her first 2 laps of this race before losing the lead to Chris Roman off of pit cycles. Later on lap 129, Martin Carx Jr. would retake the lead. He would lead all the way until lap 132, where JP Drive would take the lead once again, leading all the way until lap 133, where Flipped Over would retake the lead, leading the field until lap 135, where Harvey Rodcap would take the lead again. But somehow, he would lose the lead after 80 yards to Denny Carlin, who would lead all the way until lap 138. But of course, Jackson Storm would retake the lead, leading all the way until lap 143. But then, Kyle Carson would push Jackson Storm on lap 143, then take the lead for himself and lead all the way until almost the end of lap 144. But then JD McPillar would retake the lead, leading all the way until lap 146, where Arthur Castro would retake the lead off of pit cycles. But then Conrad Camber would take the lead after Arthur Castro went to go pit. But then, after the pit stops are done, Jackson Storm would retake the lead. He would lead all the way until lap 150, where Rowdy Revan Bush would be back in the lead. He would lead until lap 152, where Harvey Rodcap would take the lead once again, leading for 2 more laps before Gogo Logano would push Harvey Rodcap, and then Gogo Logano would take the lead for himself on lap 154, leading for 4 more laps before Tim Treadless would take the lead again. He would lead for 2 more laps before Jackson Storm would take the lead again, leading for 8 more laps before James Garrison would take the lead once again, leading all the way until lap 175, where his teammate Billy Carjoy would take the lead from him. He would lead for 3 more laps before Martin Carx Jr. would take the lead on lap 177. But then, Bad Brad Keselowski would take the lead very soon after Martin Carx Jr. did. But then, Jackson Storm would pass him for the lead just a handful of yards later. Another handful of yards later, JP Drive would take the lead for himself. But after about 10 yards, James Garrison would be back in the lead. But he only enjoyed the lead for about 20 yards before Rowdy Revan Bush would take the lead, leading until around turn 2, where Dan Garcia would take the lead. He wouldn't lead for very long at all because JD McPillar would take the lead for himself later in the lap. But then Spiky Phillips would take the lead just 5 yards later. And then another 5 yards later, Harvey Rodcap would retake the lead. But then, only after a few more yards, Henry Dahl would retake the lead, leading for about 5 yards as well before Cam Spinner would take the lead. He'd lead for about 19 yards before Martin Carx Jr. would take the lead. He'd lead for a bit longer, about 100 yards, before Aaron Clocker would take the lead. He would lead for about 13 yards before Bubba Wheelhouse would take the lead for himself. He'd lead for about 50 yards before Bad Brad Keselowski would lead the field to turn 3, and then Jackson Storm would take the lead. Soon after that, James Garrison would retake the lead, but then his teammate JD McPillar would take the lead from James himself. But then JD McPillar would lose the lead to Herb Kerbler. Herb Kerbler would not lead for very long as JD McPillar would retake the lead literally 20 yards later. But then Sebastian Silva would take the lead for himself during this lap. And then Arthur Castro would pass him just a handful of seconds later. And then Rowdy Revan Bush would take the lead for himself and then leave the field almost to turn 4 before Kyle Carson would take the lead. It's not even turn 4 yet, and Gogo Logano has already taken the lead. But then, Rowdy Revan Bush would lead for a whopping 2 yards before Jackson Storm would take the lead and finally get the field through turn 4. But he doesn't even take the lead into the next lap. That will be James Garrison, who would be the final car to take the lead this lap, leading the field finally into lap 178. This lap, lap 177 of the 2017 BnL 500, is the single lap with the most lead changes in Piston Cup history, with a whopping 29 lead changes happening. How does any one lap have 29 lead changes? There are whole races that see fewer lead changes. James Garrison wouldn't even retain the lead for all of lap 178 because Harvey Rodcap would take the lead, and he would leave the field until lap 180, where Jackson Storm would retake the lead once again. But he wouldn't lead for very long because Gogo Logano would take the lead later in the lap. But on lap 186, Rowdy Revan Bush would be back in the lead. He would lead for 6 laps before Ed Trumkin would take the lead, surprisingly, off of pit cycles. But later on lap 192, Danny Suarez would take the lead for the first time this race. But then, later on lap 197, Chase Racelot would take the lead. 2 laps later, James Garrison would be back in the lead, leading until lap 202, where Kurt Buschtire would take the lead for the first time this race, leading for 2 laps before Flipped Over would take the lead. He would lead for 5 laps before Jackson Storm would retake the lead. He would lead until lap 214, where Harvey Rodcap would take the lead once again, leading the field into lap 215. But then, Martin Carx Jr. would take the lead for himself, leading all the way until lap 221, where H.J. Hollis would take the lead after Martin Carx Jr. went to pit. But then, Tim Treadless would take the lead soon before lap 221 ended. But on lap 223, Bad Brad Keselowski would take the lead. But then, on lap 224, Jackson Storm would be back in the lead. He would lead all the way until lap 231, where JP Drive would take the lead and lead for just under a mile before JD McPillar would take the lead once again, leading all the way until lap 235, where his teammate Billy Carjoy would take the lead from him. He would lead until lap 237, where Harvey Rodcap would retake the lead. He wouldn't lead for very long as Rowdy Revan Bush would take the lead for himself and lead all the way until lap 239, where Denny Carlin, his teammate, would take the lead from him. He would lead until lap 240, where Rich Mixon would take the lead off of pit cycles. But then, Cruz Ramirez would take the lead once again on lap 240, also as a result of pit cycles. But then, Ryan Inside Laney would take the lead on lap 240, right as pit cycles were ending. And Danny Suarez would take the lead on lap 240 and leave the field into the next lap, where Jackson Storm would take the lead again. He'd keep the lead until lap 255, where James Garrison would take the lead once again. He would lead for 3 more laps before Kyle Carson would take the lead for himself, leading all the way until lap 260, where Gogo Logano would take the lead once again, leading all the way until lap 263, where H.J. Hollis would take the lead. He would lead for 2 laps before number 2, Bad Brad Keselowski would take the lead, leading for 4 laps, but then number 4, JD McPillar would take the lead for himself, leading all the way until lap 271, where Billy Carjoy would take the lead once again. But then, on lap 276, Danny Suarez would take the lead off of pit cycles. But then, later that lap, Harvey Rodcap would take the lead and lead all the way until lap 279. And then somehow, Conrad Camber ends up in the lead. He would soon lose it to Nick Shift, who would lead for 3 more laps before losing the lead to Martin Carx Jr., who would lead all the way until lap 294. But then, Jackson Storm would retake the lead again. But he would only keep it for 2 laps because Cruz Ramirez would take the lead for just 1 lap before Rowdy Revan Bush would retake the lead once again. He would lead for 3 more laps before James Garrison would take the lead. He wouldn't lead for very long though, as his teammate Chris Roman would take the lead. But he wouldn't even lead for that long either, because Flipped Over would take the lead right before lap 299. but on lap 300, Kevin Harvick would take the lead. He will lead for 2 laps before Jackson Storm, as usual, would take the lead. He would lead for 4 laps before Harvey Rodcap would take the lead again, leading for 2 more laps before Rowdy Revan Bush, another racer who's been taking the lead a lot, will lead until lap 314. But later that lap, JP Drive would take the lead for himself, leading for 4 more laps before Flipped Over would take the lead again. He would lead until lap 323, where Jackson Storm would take the lead again. He would lead until lap 325, where Gogo Logano would push Jackson Storm out of the way on this lap, and then take the lead on lap 325, leading for 3 more laps. But then Martin Carx Jr. would pass him on the outside and take the lead until lap 330, where Ryan Inside Laney would take the lead again. He would lead until lap 333, where H.J. Hollis would take the lead once again. He wouldn't lead for very long, as Henry Dahl would take the lead soon before lap 333 ended. He would lead the field until lap 334, where Danny Suarez would take the lead again. He would lead for 3 more laps before Jackson Storm would take the lead again, leading all the way until lap 341, where Flipped Over would take the lead again. He would lead for 2 more laps before Aaron Clocker would take the lead off of pit cycles. But after the pit stops were done, Rowdy Revan Bush would retake the lead. He would lead for 5 more laps before James Garrison would take the lead for another 4 laps. But then Tim Treadless would take the lead on lap 352 and lead for about half a mile before Sebastian Silva would take the lead for himself, leading for 3 more laps. But then Denny Carlin would take the lead again, and he'd lead for 2 more laps before Cam Spinner would take the lead again. And then on lap 361, JP Drive would take the lead. He wouldn't even lead for a whole mile before James Garrison would retake the lead. He would lead for 5 more laps before Jackson Storm would retake the lead. He would lead until lap 375, where Martin Carx Jr. would take the lead again, leading for 2 more laps. But then Kevin Harvick would take the lead again, leading for 3 more laps before Rowdy Revan Bush would take the lead again, leading for 5 more laps before Jackson Storm would lead for 5 more laps. But then Martin Carx Jr. would take the lead on lap 389 and lead for less than 5 laps, because on lap 393, Denny Carlin would retake the lead, leading for 3 more laps. But then Harvey Rodcap would take the lead for 2 laps, and then on lap 398, Billy Carjoy would be back in the lead, leading until lap 405, where James Garrison would take the lead once again, leading for 3 more laps before Jackson Storm would take the lead again, leading for 8 more laps before being passed by Ryan Inside Laney from the outside. He would lead until lap 418, where Kevin Harvick would take the lead for himself again and lead for 3 more laps. But then Paul Conrev would be 16th as of lap 421. But then, oh no! Paul Conrev gets loose, and this ends up wrecking Conrad Camber, Jackson Storm, Chris Pusher, Cam Spinner, Cruz Ramirez, Ricky Speedster, Donald Rodriguez, Ty Rod, Rich Mixon, Ed Trunken, H.J. Hollis, and Paul Conrev himself. And now they're all out! Rowdy Revan Bush will take the lead after the restart and lead for 3 more laps before JP Drive would take the lead for himself, leading until lap 428. But then Danny Suarez would take the lead and lead for 4 laps before Rowdy Revan Bush would retake the lead for 2 more laps. But then Ryan Inside Laney would take the lead for himself, leading until lap 436, where Bad Brad Keselowski would take the lead again, leading for 3 more laps. But then Flipped Over would take the lead and lead until lap 440. Harvey Rodcap would retake the lead on lap 440 and then lead for 6 more laps before Danny Suarez would retake the lead once again, leading for 2 more laps before Tim Treadless, with a pass on the high line, would take the lead. But on lap 449, Martin Carx Jr. would be back in the lead. He would lead all the way until lap 453, where Ryan Inside Laney would be back in the lead. But then on lap 457, J.D. McPillar would retake the lead. He would lead until lap 461, where James Garrison would take the lead, leading until lap 468. Meanwhile, on lap 465, James Garrison was the first car this race to lead by more than 1 second! Wow, this race has been competitive. But on lap 468, Martin Carx Jr. would retake the lead, leading for 4 more laps before J.D. McPillar would take the lead once again. He would lead for 2 more laps before Sebastian Silva, his teammate, would take the lead off of pit cycles, but then flipped over, would stay out of pit road, and lead all the way until lap 477, where James Garrison would take the lead once again, leading all the way until lap 482, where Danny Suarez would take the lead. He would lead for 3 more laps before Harvey Rodcap would take the lead once again, leading for 2 laps before Herb Kerbler would lead the field into lap 487, where Rowdy Revan Bush would take the lead once again. He would lead until lap 490, where Flipped Over would take the lead until lap 494, where Harvey Rodcap would take the lead once again, leading for 4 more laps before Danny Suarez would take the lead on lap 498. And with 1 to go, James Garrison will take the lead, but he'd only lead for about 100 yards because Danny Suarez would retake the lead on lap 499 and lead the field to the checkered flag to win the 2017 BnL 500, getting his first career victory in one of the most competitive Piston Cup races of all time. Kyle Carson will finish second this race, followed by Harvey Rodcap in third, James Garrison fourth, Rowdy Revan Bush fifth, Ryan Inside Laney sixth, Martin Carx Jr. seventh, Flipped Over eighth, Denny Carlin ninth, and Billy Carjoy rounding out the top 10. Jonas Carvers was the last car to finish on the lead lap this race, finishing 30th. This race had so many lead changes, but yet it still doesn't have more than the gridlock, the 1984 Dynaco 400. If anything, this race has something that not even that race has, and that's 29 lead changes in 1 lap. Nick Shift, Bad Brad Karslowski, JP Drive, JD McPillar, and Chris Roman round out the top 15, all of whom led plenty of laps this race. Same with Tim Treadless, who finished 16th. Aaron Clocker, not as many, but he still did lead laps. Same with Sebastian Silva, Henry Dahl, and Spiky Phillips, who rounds out the top 20. Even 21st place Kevin Carvick, 22nd place Arthur Carstro, Chase Racelot, Gogo Logano, and Bubba Wheelhouse, rounding out the top 25, all led laps. But Ryan Newcar, the Rocket, who finished 26th this race, did not lead a single lap this race. Even Kurt Buschtire, Herb Kerbler, Dan Garcia, all led laps. Jonas Carvers, despite being the last car to finish on the lead lap, did not lead any laps this race. Even Conrad Camber and Jackson Storm, who led a lot of laps, didn't even finish the race. Chris Pusher, although not leading any laps, finishes 33rd and in the garage for his first race. Cam Spitter and Cruz Ramirez both led laps this race. Ricky Speedster didn't lead any laps, but he did lead laps in his first race. And there's 3 more racers that had a DNF this race that led laps. Rich Mixon, Ed Trunken, and H.J. Hollis. I feel bad for everybody who wrecked out of the race, as well as everybody who didn't lead a lap. Now, after this very competitive race, Cruz Ramirez remains the points leader, with Martin Carx Jr. not too far behind now. Danny Suarez, Chase Racelot, and Jackson Storm round out the top 5, with Ryan Inside Laney, Kyle Carson, Gogo Logano, Bad Brad Karslowski, and Bubba Wheelhouse rounding out the top 10. Not super far behind. And 20 points behind Bubba is 11th place Nick Shift, who gained that position at the expense of H.J. Hollis, who falls to 12th as a result of not having a very good race. Harvey Rodcap, JP Drive, and Rowdy Revan Bush round out the top 15, with Aaron Clocker, Denny Carlin, Tim Treadless, Kevin Carvick, and J.D. McPillar rounding out the top 20, with Spiky Phillips still 6 points behind in 21st.
Remember to press the notifications button, which goes ring, ring, ring after you press it. And lightning strikes back, and that's as if you subscribed, of course. And thank you for watching this entire
Now
video.
that was one of the most competitive races ever in Piston Cup history. Explaining why this video is so long. The 8th race of the 2017 Piston Cup season's video will be coming out soon enough. I don't think that race is going to have quite as many lead changes. But unfortunately, we cannot forget that the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine is still ongoing. The Ukrainian people just wanted to live in peace and have freedom, but this common dream was ruined by the tyrant and bully Vladimir Putin, who ordered this senseless war in the first place. Currently, Crimea, the Donbass, and parts of the Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts are illegally occupied by Vladimir Putin's tyranny. We here at the KA Bullets Piston Cup YouTube channel stand with Ukraine in their struggle against Vladimir Putin's tyranny and recognize Ukraine's true borders as shown by this map.
Слава Україні! Героям слава! Нехай швидше дарується Україні перемога! Glory to Ukraine! Glory to the heroes! May Ukraine be granted victory very soon.
What's even more unfortunate is that war is not the only international war going on right now. I'm currently showing you that there is another one going on, with another authoritarian leader trying to keep his people down.